Professor von Dusen's Problems by Jacques Futrelle. The Problem of Dressing Room A. Professor von Dusen, the man. It was absolutely impossible. 25 chess masters from the world at large foregathered in Boston for the annual championship unanimously declared it impossible, and unanimity on any given point is an unusual mental causation for chess masters. Not one would concede that for an instant that it was within the range of human achievement. Some grew red in the face as they argued it, others smiled loftily and were silent. Still others dismissed the matter, in a word, as wholly absurd. A usual remark by the distinguished science and logician Professor von Dusen provoked this discussion. He had, in the past, caused bitter disputes by chance remarks. In fact, he had once been a sort of controversial center of the sciences. It had been due to his modest announcement of a starting and an orthodox hypothesis that he had been asked to vacate the chair of philosophy in that great university. Later, that university had been honored when he accepted its degree of LL.D. For a score of years now, educational and scientific institutions of the world had amused themselves by crowding degrees on him. He had initials that stood for things he could not pronounce. Degrees from England, Russia, Germany, Italy, Sweden, and Spain. These were expressed recognition of the fact that he was the foremost brain in science. The imprint of his crabbed personality lay heavily on half a dozen of its branches. Finally, there came a time when argument was respectfully silent in the face of one of his conclusions. The remark which had arrayed the chess masters of the world in so formidable and unanimous assent was made by Professor von Dusen in the presence of three other gentlemen of standing. One of these, Dr. Charles Elbert, happened to be a chess enthusiast. "Chess is a shameless perversion of the functions of the brain," was Professor von Dusen's declaration, in his perpetually irritated voice. "It is a sheer waste of effort. Greater presents of its possibility the most difficult of all fixed abstract problems. Of course, logic will solve it. Logic will solve any problem, and most of them, but any of them. Thorough understanding of its rules would be enable to anyone to defeat your greatest chess players. It would be inevitable, just as inevitable as that 2 and 2 makes 4, and sometimes, but always. I don't know chess, because I never do useless things, but I could take a few hours of competent instruction and defeat a man who has devoted his life to it. His mind is cramped, bound down to the logic of chess. Mine is not. Mine employs logic in its widest scope." Dr. Ebert shook his head vigorously. "It is not impossible," he asserted. "Nothing is impossible," snapped the scientist. "The human mind can do anything. It is all we have to lift us above the brute creation. For heaven's sake, leave us that." "Do you know the purposes of chess, its countless combinations?" asked Dr. Elbert. "No," was the crabby reply. "I know nothing whatsoever of the game beyond the general purpose which, I understand, is to move certain pieces in certain directions to stop an opponent from moving his king. Is that correct?" "Yes," said Dr. Elbert slowly, "but I never heard it stated just that way before." "Then, if that is correct, I maintain that the true logician can defeat the chess expert by the pure mechanical rule of logic. I'll take a few hours some time, acquaint myself with the moves of the pieces, and defeat you and convince..." Professor von Dusen glared savagely into the eyes of Dr. Elbert. "Not me," said Dr. Elbert. "You say anyone. You, for instance, might defeat the greatest chess player. Would you be willing to meet the greatest chess player after you acquaint yourself with the game?
Certainly,
said the scientist.
I have frequently found it necessary to make a fool of myself to convince people. I'll do it again.
This, then, was the acrimonious beginning of the discussion which aroused chess masters and brought open dissent from eminent men who had not dared for years to dispute any assertions of the distinguished Professor von Dusen. It was arranged that at the conclusion of the championships, Professor von Dusen should meet the winner. This happened to be Tchaikovsky, the Russian, who had been a chess champion for half a dozen years. After this expected result of the tournament, Hilbury, a noted American master, spent a morning with Professor von Dusen in the latter's modest apartments on Beacon Hill. He left there with a sadly puzzled face. That afternoon, Professor von Dusen met the Russian champion. The newspapers had said a great deal about the affair, and hundreds were present to witness the game. There was a little murmur of astonishment when Professor von Dusen appeared. He was slight, to the point of childishness, with his thin shoulders seeming to droop beneath the weight of his enormous head. He wore a number 8 hat. His brow rose straight and dome-like, and with a heavy shock of long yellow hair gave him the most grotesque appearance. The eyes were narrow slits of blue, squinting internally through thick glasses. The face was small, clean-shaven, and white, with the pallor of a student. His lips made a perfectly straight line. His hands were remarkable for their whiteness, their flexibility, and for their length of the slender fingers. One glance showed that the physical development should never have entered into the schedule of the scientist's 50 years of life. The Russian smiled as he sat down at the chess table. He felt that he was humoring a crank. The other masters were grouped nearby, curiously expectant. Professor von Dusen began the game, opening with the Queen's Gambit. At his 5th move, he made without the slightest hesitation. The smile left the Russian's face. At the 10th, the masters grew tensely eager. The Russian champion was playing for the honor now. Professor von Dusen's 14th move was King's Castle to Queen's 4. "Check," he announced. After a long study of the board, the Russian protected his king with a knight. Professor von Dusen noted the play and leaned back in his chair with his fingertips pressed together. His eyes left the board, and he dreamily studied the ceiling. For at least 15 minutes, there was no sound, no movement. And then, "Mate in 15 moves," he said quietly. There was a quick gasp of astonishment. It took the practiced eyes of the masters several minutes to verify the announcement. But the Russian champion saw, and leaned back in his white chair as he dazed. He was not astonished. He was helplessly floundering in amazement of incomprehensible things. Suddenly he rose and grasped the slender man by his hand. "You have never played chess before?" he asked. "Never." "Mon Dieu, you are not a man, you are a brain, a machine, a thinking machine." "It's a child's game," said the scientist abruptly. There was a note of exultation in his voice. It was still the irritable, impersonable tone which was habitual. Then, this was Professor von Dusen. This is how he became known to be the world at large as a thinking machine. The Russian's phrase had been applied to the scientists by the title of the newspaper reporter, Hudson Hatch,